In a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape, new claims are emerging from sources with close ties to the Kremlin that could reshape our understanding of international power dynamics. Today, we delve into one startling development. A source close to Moscow has suggested that President Donald Trump's so called unprecedented concessions to Russia might pave the way for aggressive actions against key European cities, such as Brussels, Paris, and even London. This revelation arrives just weeks after an expert warned that Vladimir Putin could be planning a mass casualty event in Europe, a warning that has raised alarms on multiple fronts. The source we're relying on is not just any outsider. He is deeply connected within the very heart of Kremlin circles, steeped in the inner workings of Russian state affairs. His words suggest that President Trump's recent approach toward Moscow, which many have dismissed as a gesture of diplomatic overture, is not just a simple negotiation tactic. Instead, it appears to be a calculated move that could have far-reaching strategic implications. According to the insider, these concessions may essentially act as a green light for Russia to pursue a more aggressive posture on the European continent, targeting major cities that are not only political and economic hubs, but also steeped in historical significance. To understand the gravity of this claim, it is important to revisit the unfolding scenario in international politics. For some time now, analysts and strategists have speculated that if President Trump were to return to the White House, U.S. support for Ukraine could diminish significantly. This speculation is not without reason. Over the past months, the speed at which Trump appears to have been strengthening contacts and relations with Russia has both surprised and unsettled political observers across the globe. The newfound rapport between Trump and Moscow has raised questions about the future of NATO, a topic that is not only timely, but also of critical importance to European nations whose security is interlinked with the backbone of the alliance. Adding another layer of complexity to this situation is the outspoken stance of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who recently remarked that Putin is scared of Trump. Zelensky's comment, delivered in a backdrop of ongoing military and diplomatic struggles between Ukraine and Russia, underscores a contradiction in the narrative. On the one hand, there is an image of Russia as a formidable force, willing to risk significant actions on European soil. On the other hand, if Putin is indeed intimidated by Trump, as Zelensky maintains, what does this mean for the stability of global alliances and the future of conflicts that have simmered for years? The question lingers. Are these concessions a sign of weakness or a strategic retreat enabling Moscow to execute a larger game plan? As these debates rage, the public must also consider the views of several prominent figures in global politics. For instance, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has sparked controversy by hinting that the United States might, in certain scenarios, ignore the protections offered under NATO's Article 5. This declaration is not to be taken lightly. NATO's Article 5 is a pivotal clause that states if one member is attacked, it is considered an attack against all members, warranting a collective response. Hegseth's implications, suggesting that if Europe were to take military action against Russia, the United States might not automatically intervene, have sent shockwaves among European leaders who look to Washington for strategic reassurance. The narrative now shifts to the cultural and symbolic dimensions of this diplomatic drama. On the Russian television program The Evening with Vladimir Solovyov, an influential figure made statements that further contextualize the unfolding events. Karen Shakhnazarov, the Director General of Mosfilm, the iconic film production company, shared his enthusiastic perspective on the recent high-level discussions between global leaders. Shakhnazarov described these conversations as indisputably beneficial, emphasizing that even the act of a U.S. president calling the Russian president is revolutionary in its symbolism. He went on to say, "The President of the United States called the President of Russia. That alone is already a major success." He elaborated by drawing a parallel between this modern exchange and a historical moment reminiscent of when Julius Caesar once reached out to a barbarian chieftain. His analogy not only captured the imagination of many viewers, but also underscored the monumental nature of such an exchange, which he sees as a rupture in the long-standing blockade of isolating dialogues between adversarial states. In his remarks, Shakhnazarov suggested that breaking this long-standing stalemate has far-reaching ramifications. The idea is that if the barriers have been shattered, then the political ladder is wide open, allowing for more radical and bold maneuvers than ever before. For Moscow's enemies in Europe, such a move could be interpreted as a sign that the era of rigid, predictable alliances might be coming to an end. And if that is indeed the case, one cannot ignore the cautionary words that have emerged from other expert quarters. Political scientist Sergei Mikheyev provided additional context by warning European leaders to brace themselves for what could lie ahead. According to Mikheyev, in this situation, we should make it clear for the Europeans. Now we can really strike Brussels, London, or Paris because we can forget about Article 5. You can forget the notion that Americans would step in on your behalf. Such a statement challenges centuries-old assumptions about the reach and reliability of American commitments under NATO. The possibility that European capitals could become vulnerable targets if America steps back serves as a chilling reminder of the precarious balance of power. It is imperative to consider the broader historical context to fully grasp the implications of these claims. The United States and Russia have navigated a rivalry that is as old as the Cold War. Throughout history, moments of détente, when the leaders of these two superpowers engaged directly, often in an unexpected and dramatic manner, have led to both breakthrough cooperation and dangerous escalation. In this case, President Trump's approach, seen by some as conciliatory and by others as opportunistic, adds yet another twist to an already convoluted narrative. While many believe that a soft stance toward Russia might foster peace, critics argue that such an approach could embolden Moscow to act with impunity on the global stage. The complexities do not end there. At the very heart of this dramatic unfolding is the issue of trust, or rather, the lack thereof. With each diplomatic maneuver, the bonds of trust between allies and adversaries are further strained. For European nations that have long relied on the U.S. as a stalwart ally, the idea of a shift in American policy is both unsettling and dangerous. In cities like Brussels, Paris, and London, the specter of an aggressive Russian strategy has already kindled a sense of vulnerability. Officials in these capitals are now faced with the profound challenge of recalibrating their security strategies in an era where traditional assumptions about alliances may no longer hold firm. As these discussions evolve in the corridors of power, it is important to look at what everyday citizens are being told. In recent news updates and passionate op-ed pieces, leading commentators have drawn parallels between these international developments and other pressing domestic issues. The recent speeches by J.D. Vance on immigration and critiques of political elites by former British ministers have all added layers of complexity to the narrative. The way these messages converge suggests that the world is at a crossroads, a moment when historical paradigms are being questioned and the lines between domestic and international politics blur. Parallel to this, influential voices such as that of Keir Starmer have raised warnings about the considerable cost associated with current strategies in dealing with Ukraine. His cautionary tone suggests that if the ongoing conflict in Ukraine continues unchecked, the ripple effects could destabilize even the most secure parts of Europe. The intersection of these various threads, the internal political debates within Europe, the shifting allegiances in Washington, and the bold actions suggested by Moscow insiders, paints a picture of a world in flux, where yesterday's certainties are rapidly dissolving into a landscape marked by unpredictability and risk. Another critical aspect of this unfolding drama is the inherent risk posed by miscalculation on all sides. With President Trump's rapid rapprochement with Russia, there is an underlying fear that the traditional deterrence balance might be disrupted. For decades, the doctrine of mutual assured destruction and the credibility of NATO's collective defense have acted as stabilizers in international relations. However, if the American stance becomes ambiguous or worse, disengaged, then Europe might find itself facing a formidable adversary with fewer checks on its ambition. This is compounded by the fact that Kremlin analysts are urging their forces to accelerate their territorial ambitions in Ukraine. Speculation is rife that following high level discussions between Trump and the Russian leadership, Moscow might feel emboldened to annex additional Ukrainian territories without the fear of international reprisal. All these developments coalesce into a narrative that is as much about perception as it is about strategy. The interplay of domestic politics, international alliances, and historical legacies creates a milieu in which every move is scrutinized and every statement can be weaponized. As the world watches the unfolding complexities between Russia, Europe, and the United States, questions about the future size up from every corner. Will the newfound, albeit controversial, approach by President Trump lead to a recalibration of global alliances? Or will it ultimately leave Europe exposed to aggressive threats that could redefine the security architecture of the continent? For many, the answer remains obscured by the fog of diplomatic maneuvering and the overlapping interests of powerful nations. American policymakers argue that dialogue, even with adversaries, is essential for averting catastrophic conflict. Conversely, hardliners from across the Atlantic warn that any perceived concession to Moscow could embolden Putin to take more aggressive and potentially irreversible steps. They argue that such actions might signal to Russia that its ambitions in Eastern Europe are not only tolerated, but could be rewarded, placing entire cities at risk. In cities like Brussels, Paris, and London, where political, economic, and cultural legacies converge, the implied threat is both symbolic and practical. A destabilized Europe could lead to economic downturns, migration crises, and a renewed wave of nationalism that turns inward rather than cooperating on the global stage. As this tension builds, questions are also being raised domestically about the future of U.S. foreign policy. Some critics argue that President Trump's outreach to Russia might be interpreted as a pragmatic attempt to recalibrate American commitments abroad. Others worry it could signal a broader ideological shift, a move toward isolationism or a realignment of America's traditional role as a global guarantor of security. This internal debate is fueled further by partisan divisions that have long characterized American politics. When Washington appears to hedge its alliances in favor of a more ambiguous transactional politics, the impact is felt not just abroad, but at home. Constituents on both sides of the aisle are left wondering whether the pursuit of short-term diplomatic achievements might undermine the long-term stability of the international order, thereby leaving America and its allies open to new forms of aggression. Even within strategic circles, there is no consensus on how events will unfold. Some senior military officials suggest that the enhanced dialogue between Trump and Kremlin experts might open channels for reducing nuclear risks, creating opportunities for arms control agreements long thought to be relics of the Cold War. Yet, on the other hand, voices like that of Defense Secretary Hegseth remain on high alert. His pointed indication that the United States might not come to the rescue under NATO's Article 5 if Europe is attacked carries a heavy implication. He hinted that should European nations decide to take military action against Russia independently, the American response could be dramatically muted. This suggestion, if taken literally, undermines the long-held principle that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. Such claims and counterclaims are fueling a debate that extends well beyond the confines of traditional policy circles. For citizens in Europe, this debate is a matter of existential importance. It is no longer a question of whether aggressive actions can be expected, but rather how prepared their governments are to face a potential crisis that strikes at the very heart of their national pride and security. This complex interplay of diplomacy, deterrence, and domestic political calculations lays bare the precarious nature of international trust in these turbulent times. And yet, amid such high stakes, there are voices urging calm and advocating for a measured approach. They argue that every major player in the international arena has a vested interest in preventing conflict from spiraling out of control. The recent calls for negotiations, combined with the unusual cordiality between leaders who were once seen as arch-enemies, might hint at an emerging, albeit fragile, new order. Karen Shaknazarov's colorful analogy, even likening President Trump's overture to a modern day Julius Caesar reaching out to a barbarian, illustrates the potential for such moments to redefine old alliances and engender new strategies. In other words, while the risk of aggressive action looms large, there might also be opportunities for fostering stability through dialogue if all parties are willing to take measured steps rather than impulsive leaps into conflict. Nonetheless, political scientist Sergei Mikheyev's blunt observation remains a stark reminder of the risks involved. Europe might very well find itself isolated in the face of these rapidly evolving shifts, with American assurances under NATO's Article 5 potentially rendered ineffective. His warning that the possibility of striking major cities like Brussels, London, or Paris cannot be dismissed challenges long held doctrines about mutual defense and collective security. This perspective is not merely academic. It resonates with real fears among European policymakers who have witnessed firsthand the consequences of strategic miscalculations in past conflicts. Given the rapidly evolving nature of these developments, the international community must now grapple with a series of critical questions. How will Europe recalibrate its defensive strategies in light of these new realities? What message does Trump's overture send to global adversaries and allies alike? And, very importantly, if the United States is perceived as willing to ease its support for Ukraine in favor of a more conciliatory relationship with Russia, what does that mean for the countless citizens who have already suffered in protracted conflicts? These questions are not merely rhetorical. They demand serious consideration from every corner of the political spectrum, from the hallowed halls of NATO councils to the daily concerns of families in urban centers across the continent. In tandem with these grim assessments, there have also been calls for increased public engagement and vigilance. Media outlets and independent analysts are urging citizens to stay informed by signing up for free newsletters and following trusted news sources that offer in-depth analyses, not superficial commentary. For those interested in exploring these topics further, recent pieces detailing J.D. Vance's impassioned immigration speech and critiques of political commissars, as well as Keir Starmer's admonitions about the staggering costs of current Ukraine war strategies, offer valuable insights. These narratives, although diverse in focus, ultimately converge on a single point. In an era of unprecedented geopolitical shifts, we must pay careful attention to every development, no matter how seemingly routine. As the source with Kremlin ties continues to make waves with his provocative assertions, it is clear that his words are not being delivered in a vacuum. They are part of a broader dialogue that spans continents and affects millions of lives. Just as the old masters of statecraft once maneuvered behind closed doors, so too are today's leaders engaging in complex, high-stakes negotiations that carry the potential to reshape the balance of power. And while some see opportunities for innovation in diplomacy, a chance to break free from the impasses of the past, others warn that the risks of miscalculation are too high.